It is a very puzzling thing to see Christians that know what the scriptures have to state about the essence of man repeating secularist talking points and adhering to them when those things stand diametrically opposed to what scripture teaches about the essence of man. And that sort of contradiction allows all sorts of erroneous ideas to settle in, which then leads a person to make decisions and to view things in a way that is actually against Christian ethics. One of these manifestations, and this is pretty popular in our day and age and in our culture, is when the Bible talks about the nature of man being essentially evil, that man is not inherently good. But what is it that culture teaches? No, men are inherently good. Again, the Bible states that we are essentially evil and that we need a redeemer. Secular culture teaches man is inherently good. Again, there's not any type of bridge that can bridge that gap between the teachings of what the Bible teaches, what Christianity teaches proper, and secularism. But Christians will repeat many of the same secularist talking points that are standing in contradiction to what the Christian ethic teaches. And therefore, you hear and you see that this affects the way that they go on in daily living, make decisions, and teach doctrines which leaves Christians defenseless to the wiles, machinations, and the problems associated with sinful human nature. And that's one thing that I'd like to highlight on this edition, on this live stream of Irrespective. I was sent an audio file, listened to the entirety of the podcast, and I'll give the explanation as to why I'm offering this disclaimer shortly. But what I'd like to do on this live stream is to demonstrate the problems with embracing ideas that directly contradict what the Bible has to teach us about human nature and the dangers associated with that. Hopefully, you'll stick with me for the rest of this episode because I think it'll be an insightful live stream episode of Irrespective. Welcome each and every one of you to this new live stream episode. For those of you that might be joining us for the first time, my name is Gio. Welcome all. Welcome one. Welcome all. Some housekeeping items before I continue with the topic today. Subscribe, hit that notification bell, click that thumbs up button, and share if you have not done so yet. Whether you're watching this on YouTube or Rumble, please remember to subscribe if you have not done so yet. You can also, if you have an account on X, subscribe to our channel there. Hitting the notification bell is something that is exclusive to YouTube and Rumble, but you can click on the thumbs up button on Rumble and on YouTube on this video. There's organic interest on the channel. They'll begin to suggest it to others, so please do that. And also like our content on X so that the algorithms were to pick up on organic interest and begin to share our content with others. And please personally do so. Share our content with others. For those of you that have been doing that, we thank you so much for your consideration. I would also encourage the audience to interact with us. Again, on all the streaming platforms, X, YouTube, Rumble, that this stream is made available. You can interact with me by placing your questions and or comments in the chat. Also, I would encourage the audience to donate. It helps us to keep the lights on here. We exist to tell it as it is. We are not beholden to any organization or person. We are beholden to God Almighty. We are beholden to Jesus Christ. And therefore, irrespective, that is the motto. We are going to tell the truth because God is not a respecter of persons, and neither are we. And that allows us, that gives us the opportunity to speak the truth unabashedly. If you enjoy what we do here, scan that QR code that just appeared on the screen. Conversely, you can click on the link available to you in the description box underneath the video. Be taken to PayPal's website, which we use to process those donations. For those of you that have been donating, thank you so much for your patronage. If you are considering donating and will donate, thank you again beforehand. And last but not least, do not forget to follow us on the socials. On X, you can find us under the username Irrespective77. You can also follow our account on TikTok. The username there is @the Irrespective. Now, a disclaimer here, this is important, and I am doing this at a bit of a risk to the channel, but the truth is this important. And a couple of things before I continue. The folks that you are about to hear that I will play back the audio and use as the prime example of what I'd like to talk to you about today. This is a podcast that they co-host, specifically pretty famous farmer amongst homesteaders and back to the landers, as some are known in this movement in the United States, Joel Salatin. He also describes himself in social media circles as the lunatic farmer. You may have heard of him before. Many people see him as the spearhead or a figurehead of the back to the land movement that is currently sweeping the United States. More and more people are going back to being agrarian in their mindset and in their deployment of the very same, meaning going back to growing their own food, harvesting their own food, using the labors of their own hands instead of depending on the industrial food system and all the problems that that has brought about to American society in the last few decades. He is the figurehead, or one of the figureheads, in this movement in particular, and pretty popular because he himself has said that he is a Christian. And Dr. Sina McCullough, whom is the co-host of the Beyond Labels podcast. The reason I have to give this disclaimer is because someone sent me this audio, being that I had a conversation with this person about this topic in particular. This was something that I wanted to talk about. And curiously enough, they said, well, there's a segment in one of their recent podcast episodes where they had this interaction that fits into what you're talking about. So I said, well, send me the link, because I don't subscribe to their podcast personally because a lot of their content is behind the paywall, but this person that I know does. And they sent me the audio and I heard it. And I said, this is perfect. This actually fits in with what I'd like to talk to our audience about in one of the upcoming live streams. And therefore, I have to offer this disclaimer because this is not something that, as it were, I personally subscribe to. Again, it's behind a paywall, but in fair use, what I'd like to do is to talk about this portion of that podcast episode, to use it as for analysis, examination, criticism. And again, it fits into our topic nowadays. So I am not in any way, shape, or form advocating that people pirate this audio and their efforts. I think Joel Salatin has done a lot of good, and he continues to do a lot of good. I think he has been a major help to the body of Christ in this day and age. I think many of the things that he offers really fits in with the Christian ethic. And I've heard a few presentations from Dr. Sina McCullough, and I think a lot of the information that she herself has researched has helped and will help a lot of people. So I don't have a personal bone to pick with these individuals. I do have a bone to pick with something that they said. I need to make that distinction clear, because there are those whom simple-minded in the end will state, why do you hate? You've heard that phrase uttered over and over again. Why are you such a hater? Just because you disagree with a person's vantage point, with their viewpoint in particular, doesn't mean that you hate them. That is not only absolutely absurd, but it's a childish way and a reductionist way to take away from the substance of the argument. We're not going to do that here on Irrespective. So I need to offer all of these disclaimers so as to make clear that I'm taking issue with the point, the salient point that Mrs. McCullough is bringing up in this interaction. So I'll pause the audio, you'll hear it, and I also need to offer context so that you can understand why Joel and her engage in this following back and forth. This podcast lasts, I think, a little bit more than an hour. This podcast episode in particular, again, it's the Beyond Labels podcast. And the title, it's episode number 256, and it's titled Why Half of U.S. Farming Has Nothing to Do with Food. That's the title of this episode. Again, it's behind a paywall. You hear a portion of it because it was I was granted access to it by an intimate friend of mine. And this begins at around 33 minutes and 51 seconds of the podcast episode. What Joel has done up until this point is demonstrate that there is this problem that we essentially have in the United States, where we extend, in essence, infallibility, de facto infallibility to farmers, generally speaking. And he tries to distinguish and he gives various proofs that there are evil farmers. There are bad farmers, people with ill intent, just like there are bad police officers, just like there are bad politicians, just like there are bad judges, just like there are bad attorneys, just like there are bad mechanics. And everybody understands essentially when you use the term, the adjective bad, as a qualifier to what you're mentioning next, meaning that that person is corrupt, that person does things the wrong way. It can mean different things in different contexts, but generally speaking, we're talking about people who don't do their job correctly. And in many instances, that includes persons who have ill intent in the field in which they are operating. And that's pretty much well understood. But Joel tries to make the point, giving various examples, that one of the problems associated with this infallibility that has been given by American society, and it's a naivete that is advanced, generally speaking, to farmers, is that we're not allowed, or culture, it is the taboo thing to say that, generally speaking, there are bad farmers because they all, again, it's as childish as it gets, but all farmers do this for the right reasons. And that's not the case. As a matter of fact, that directly already begins to get into our subject matter because it directly contradicts what the Bible has to say about human nature. But Christians fall in line for the secularist, childish mindset, which, if you think about it, inculcates naivete. A naivete that should not be there, especially when you consider that we're talking about grown adults who have come to believe this myth, which allows a lot of these people to do a lot of unsavory things, sinful things, under the guise of, I'm a farmer. I do things in an altruistic fashion, so you can't judge me. That's actually unbiblical. You can't go around, that's unchristian. You can't go around automatically conferring perfection, infallibility on a whole group of people simply because they do something that, when you think about it, yes, in a sense, it is good essentially to do that. But then again, it's not like if God didn't call all of us to involve ourselves in that act. At the very beginning, I've said this before, God places Adam and Eve in an orchard. I know your popular Bible translations in English will say a garden, but the way that that's translated from the Hebrew originally is actually an orchard. But nevertheless, Adam and Eve are placed in this spot, and God says to the first couple, be fruitful and multiply, subjugate the world. So the first job, as it were, that God gives humanity is, here's the earth, here's the abundance that I have created for you, till it, take care of it, bring it under subjugation. In essence, Adam and Eve were farmers when you think about it from the very beginning. It was the very first job that God gave mankind. Okay. So there's this associated, we would call it mythos, associated with farming, that most American culture will, again, impute infallibility on the farmer as doing essentially an altruistic thing by farming. But it doesn't mean you could engage in a practice that may be seen as essentially altruistic, but actually not be good at it. And you can actually engage in certain practices and not have good intents. No, but that's not what American society has to say about farmers. So he gives a litany of evidences, and it leads to this portion of the conversation. Again, as I said, I am going to pause the audio intermittently to comment as a vivid example of what the main subject matter is for this live stream episode.
Again, all of these millions of acres growing alfalfa for Japanese and Middle Eastern racehorses, they're not growing food. And that's
one of the things he mentions, were, among other things, he talks about how U.S. farmers are, instead of trying to help reestablish our herd levels nationally, which are at the lowest levels, one of the proofs that he gives is that it basically, our herd level, cattle levels, stand at probably the lowest level since around the 1940s. And that's a problem. Even the Trump administration has had to do certain things to try to mitigate that potential disaster, which increasingly becomes more bleak as the days go on. a lot of farmers, what they're doing is that instead of replenishing, as it were, instead of saying, let's cattle farm, no, we're just going to grow the grass to send it out to the Middle East so we can feed their racehorses. In essence, one of the things he talks about is that this is national suicide. A country that can't grow its own food, especially in a country like ours where we have natural resources to be able to do it, is committing suicide. And a lot of farmers are actually helping this go along because, well, guess what? At the end of the day, this is just much more profitable than doing the other thing. Moral considerations have to be placed in all of this. So it continues.
I want folks to understand today is that when we talk about farming, and we use this word as a big tent term, don't we? I mean, we say farmers as if we're all in this together, we're on the same team, we're pulling the same direction, we're all rowing the boat the same direction, we're all punching the volleyball the same direction. And I think it's absolutely essential that people realize we can't use farmers in that type of generic terminology.
Yeah.
I think everybody that's sensible and reasonable and has a Christian ethic abiding within them, and they abide to it, would understand what he means by that. I think that's a non-controversial thing. That's not something that should excite, as it were, your moral senses, if that makes any sense. That shouldn't bring you shouldn't cause anything in you to say that's despicable of him to say so, right?
Is that kind of a new idea?
Well,
Here it comes.
What comes to mind is I'm not surprised you're getting pushback, because I think that you make an excellent point, and I'm right on board with you, like right aligned with what you're saying. And I know this sounds maybe a little bit trivial, but I would maybe say
I have to preface what you're about to hear Dr. Sina McCullough state with, this is a very similar thing to when politicians will say, I am a supporter of the Second Amendment, but however, when you study the text of the Second Amendment, it's pretty clear. There should be no prohibition on being able to own and operate firearms. It's that simple. It's a right that can't be infringed. Self-preservation, self-protection, et cetera, et cetera. But then whenever a politician says but or however, you know then that they are not supporters, strictly speaking, of the text, the underlying text of and the spirit of the Second Amendment. Similar, very similar sort of situation. Listen to how she is going to remonstrate lightly, but there's implicitness in the weight of what she's saying to what Joel, the truth that Joel spoke.
there's good farming practices and there's bad farming practices, if you want to use the good and bad, versus good farmers and bad farmers. I think that's where part of the pushback might come from.
Did you notice, again, remember what the main subject matter is of our live stream? I know that sometimes I can get overly verbose and lose myself in the weeds when talking about these things and their extensions, but please stick with me. I said at the beginning of this live stream episode that there is an essential problem with people whom state people are essentially good. That idea, when it permeates, brings down the defense level that every person should have in taking care that their own flesh doesn't manifest itself, if that makes sense. Think about it. Jesus himself says, take up your cross daily and follow me. Every Christian understands that. But that also extends not only to yourself, not allowing your sin nature to make an appearance, but also to take care that you are being very wary of your neighbor's sin nature. And it's a way to constantly be on alert and disallow the very thing which leads to evil in yourself and in others. It's a protective measure that God gives us. But now, by her terminology, because think about this, she herself says you're getting pushback because, in essence, The verbiage you're using is what is causing the controversy. Well, let's examine that. Why is the verbiage that he is using causing controversy? Not because it isn't true, but because there are various persons whom have subscribed to the idea, the myth, that essentially all farmers are good. Wait, so you're telling me that there's basically zero or almost zero people that do X and they manipulate that for ill intent? That's what you're saying. That there are no people operating in that industry, in that sector, in that group that are doing what they're doing for reasons that are unsavory. That's what you're saying. So it's best, she says, to instead of saying bad farmer, good farmer, instead of having that distinction, let's go ahead and say bad farming practices and good farming practices. But here's the essential problem. If these people are essentially good, all of them, if they're basically infallible, as I explained earlier, why would they be employing bad farming practices in the first place? Now, some of you might state, well, Gio, but what about ignorance? Granted, there is ignorance. But eventually the effects of that ignorance are going to be felt, are they not? Children can be left in a state of ignorance, but that ignorance will come back to bite them in the proverbial behind, if you know what I mean. Ignorance or ill intent, in many cases, are going to lead to bad outcomes. If you make a decision based on ignorance, it's going to bite you. If you make a decision based on evil intent, it's going to bite you, and it could potentially bite someone else, just like ignorance can. So I ask you, why the whitewashing of language when it's perfectly understandable? Reasonable people will understand what Joel meant here. There are people that engage in certain practices and they do things in an unsavory fashion to increase the bottom line. They don't care what happens downstream to people that are consuming the product as long as they're making the money, et cetera, right? No. The problem is the people taking offense with your language. So here's the question that I have. Why are people taking offense with language that pretty clearly and pretty directly describes the good-bad paradigm that the Bible, that Christianity proper talks about? Because otherwise, what you're doing is that you're whitewashing with that twisting of language, with that whitewashing of language. You're actually trying to whitewash the evil that certain people engage in. It's a form, when you think about it, of calling good evil and evil good. The very thing that the prophet Isaiah warned about. I know it's a subtlety. And some people might not think that that is something to spill any milk over. Shouldn't be spilling milk over this, Gio. But it's those small subtleties or seemingly small subtleties that lead to these wide deviations from what the Bible actually talks about, that leads people to embrace ideas that are inherently contradictory to scriptural truth and then lead them down the path of heresy. I find this interesting because these are the very same people who will quote, for example, Matthew 7:10-12, or also if he will, this is Jesus, or also if he will ask for a fish, will you give him a snake? Therefore, if you, although you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven, give good things to those who ask him? Jesus is in essence saying, it's no one good. Paul, picking up on this theme, says the same thing in Romans chapter number 3. Verse 9, what then? Do we have an advantage? Not at all. For we have already charged both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. Just as it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned aside. They have become worthless. There is no one who practices kindness. There is not even one. And it continues quoting here because these are a quotation from the 14th Psalm, verses 1-3. And then you keep reading the rest of the chapter. I've heard Christians quote these things. They're literally quoting the Bible. They're quoting Christianity when they say, there's not a single good person. And then they go down to verse 23. You've heard Romans 3:23 quoted all the time. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The Bible is in essence telling you that all are evil. Let me look at this in another way to show you the problem with the idea of all men are inherently good. If that is the case, and this is what she is using to contradict Joel's assertion, I would ask you, why do you need a redeemer then? If all men are essentially good, why do you need Jesus Christ? All of a sudden, you are dispensing with the Savior of the world. You are dispensing with Emmanuel, God with us. You are dispensing with Jesus Christ, Lord of Lords, King of Kings. You are dispensing with Christ's atoning vicarious sacrifice on the cross if all men are essentially good. So Jesus, in the best of cases under this doctrine, he died for the few bad apples, the few rotten apples in society. Everyone else didn't need a savior. You're directly contradicting what God reveals to us about human nature under the very idea of, oh, people are essentially good. And in Christians, they quote these verses, and at the same time, they embrace these other ideas which directly contradict what the Bible tells us about our nature. And it reveals itself in conversations such as we're hearing now. That doesn't make any sense. You're in essence denying the very reason why we need Jesus in the first place. It's an anti-gospel message. When you say essentially all people are good, and you shouldn't go around saying bad apples, good apples. You should be more like, let's change the verbiage here. It continues.
Because I don't think people want to, when you say there's bad farmers.
Let me go ahead and also state this. This is very typical for those that, instead of wanting to confront people with the truth and tell them you're wrong, this is very typical of those who, let me just soften my stance and try to tell them that they're not wrong. It's just, I'll just change, I'll alter my language so as to make it more palatable. That still doesn't work, because you're appeasing people whom have an erroneous idea. This is what has essentially been wrong with evangelicalism, quote unquote, in the last 20, 30, 40 years in the United States, and more generally speaking in the West, because it's been more of an appeasement religion. We're just going to appease the wrath of the sinners. And in that appeasement, what you end up doing is you actually help them subvert the gospel.
It almost implies that
how do you expect to call sinners to repentance if you tell them, no, your wrongful views are not wrong, it's just my language? They're offended, because that's what happens when you tell a person whom is wrong and they are offended with the truth. That's what happens when you speak the truth. They themselves are offended. So this is an appeasement campaign on her part, and she should just drop the cowardice and simply state people are wrong in their naivete to think all farmers, essentially, most all farmers are good. Can't do that. There are people that do things with ill intent. They're out there. Now, you'll notice that Joel shortly will push back, rightfully so, against this, but then he kind of capitulates in the name of unity. She's my co-host, so I'll just kind of, instead of presenting this as a tension, we'll just try to find common ground here. You'll notice that.
A bad intent, like an intentionality between it. And
all right, so let me ask you this, Sina. Would you say there are good mechanics and bad mechanics?
So I would say, yes, we say that, but
yeah.
I think there's a different reverence for farmers than there are.
Do you see? So you have to ask yourself the question, why? She used the term reverence. And I'm glad she uses that term, because you have to ask yourself the question, why is there this reverence for farmers? We can get into the conversation. We can get deep into that thread as to why we've gotten there as American society, where it's gone away from being an agrarian society as it was about 150, up until around 150 years ago, and then to industrialization and all that changed and whatnot. But then you have to ask yourself, why? Why is there this reverence for farmers when that's something that the vast majority of people used to do up until recent history? The aristocrat class, the landed gentry, monarchs, these were a very, very small group of people that they themselves didn't do that work. They had peons doing this for them, but the vast majority of the public they were engaged in farming practices. But since industrialization kind of flipped that order on its head, where now you have the minority of people doing the work of growing crops and helping animal husbandry, and then harvesting that, processing that meat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then leading to the industrialization of the food supply, all of that changed, leading to a place where now we confer infallibility on these people. And that allows them in many instances to engage in unsavory practices. To the point where, for example, many of them are bilking the American taxpayer for millions upon billions of dollars because they're engaged in practices that are unprofitable, like, for example, soybean farming, just to give an example. They constantly, according to what Joel was saying earlier in the podcast, they constantly fall short of projections for making money, but the U.S. government comes in, tells them, here's taxpayer money so you can continue to grow this. We'll cover the losses. Why? Why don't you just engage in farming practices that actually make you a profit? Like, for example, cattle farming, poultry farming, harvesting the crops that we actually need. No, because the U.S. government, since it has all this money available at its disposition, and they just print money out of thin air, they just keep throwing money instead of telling farmers, no, you're engaging in a practice that in essence is not profitable. Look for something else that is profitable. And that's it. Nope, can't do that. Why? But a lot of farmers know the game, and they say, oh, we're short again this year. We're short again this year. Mr. President, we need help. Mr. and Mrs. Congressperson, we need help. Can you fill the void? Give us some more of that taxpayer dollars. It's funny. We look at people, industries, conservatives and Christians in the United States, look at people that do that, industries that do that. Why do they need taxpayer money? Why can't they just be? But when farmers do this, all of a sudden they're free and clear from our criticisms. Why? It's not good for the gander, I guess, in that instance.
Mechanics.
Yeah.
And so I don't think, we've heard about it's Americans' heartland. I mean, that's literally what we call it, the heart.
But it's a myth.
And we depend on them, right? Us eaters depend on these farmers. And
Right.
so I think
But many of we depend on them. You're telling me that many of them don't engage in unsavory practices? He mentioned earlier in the podcast how many of them, as it were, lead to the desertification. That's the term that he uses, where they're in essence abusing the land to the point where it almost becomes, you can't cultivate anymore on it because of the bad farming practices. But they do it anyways because, hey, it's what I got to do. What?
they do have this, they put them in a different category. And so I think you're fighting a whole nother battle when you start saying that there's a bad farmer. So even I think just distinguishing it's a bad farming practice, because that means that that farmer, you're kind of giving them grace.
Can I ask you all a question? And I know this is getting a bit long in the tooth. I pretty much explained the problems with this idea, but why is it that attorneys, I think they'll mention it shortly, why is it that attorneys aren't seen that way? I know a lot of good attorneys. I know a lot of attorneys that are actually doing great things. They see the injustices perpetrated in different systems inside of Western society, and they said, this person needs a defense. This person needs to be protected from government prosecution. And you look at those people and say, man, these guys are doing God's work because they're trying to correct an injustice that has been perpetrated upon innocent people. And you say, man, that's a good attorney. No one bats an eye at that. And I'm saying that guy's doing the Lord's work. That woman is doing the Lord's work. And then you look at bad attorneys, the personal injury attorneys, that ilk, as it were. And no one bats an eye when those people say, man, this guy's a shark. That woman's a shark. Why? They're both engaged in the same field, but one is doing evil intent. One is leveraging the system for personal gain. Doesn't matter whom they harm. The other says, no, I'm doing this for the right reasons. And we're able to differentiate that. Believe it or not, we benefit ourselves from a lot of the good work that good attorneys do. Why aren't they on the same level with good farmers? And why aren't the bad attorneys placed with the bad farmers? No, that's the only group that seems to just get direct infallibility. Well, the police also. That's another group. Law enforcement is another one. I've talked about that before. That it's only a couple of bad apples. Come on.
Giving them like a do-over. like here, that's a bad practice, but like you're not a bad person. That it's like in parenting. They'll say like,
You're not a bad
don't
person.
say like, oh, you're bad. Say that behavior was bad. Not the child isn't bad. The behavior is bad. So it gives that.
So the Bible
psyche of that.
tells us that foolishness is attached to the heart of a child, and through the rod of correction, you will separate him from it. That's an essential thing that Christians understand when you read the Bible. No, but there are no bad children. What? Are you kidding me? This directly contradicts what the Bible has to teach on the matter.
Person more of an opportunity to just say like,
And this is why I hear Christians complaining, look at our society nowadays. Why do we have so many youths engaging in the practices? Well, if parents were to discipline their children properly, we wouldn't have this issue. Oh, but there are no bad children. There's nothing in children that we should do in order to correct what could potentially lead to devastating consequences for them and the people that they bring that devastation upon with their bad behavior, with their bad decision making, right? Can't have it both ways. You see the effects that this has not only personally, but society-wide.
Okay, I'm not going to go into a shame space here. You know, I'm not a bad person. I can redeem myself. Like I can do better. And so that's why
This is all psychobabble. What you're hearing is feminist psychobabble. That's what you're hearing. In essence, what you're hearing is don't tell a person that they are bad. A person that is engaging in bad behavior needs to be told that they're bad, lest they continue to insist upon it. And they victimize themselves, and then they victimize others also. It's that simple. This is why we have so many problems in the country now, because we're unwilling to call a spade over, I might cause offense. This is the problem with evangelicalism nowadays in the country. We're unwilling to call a spade. That's evil. Call it for what it is. You might offend someone. I don't care. But that Christian attitude of saying, I don't care if the person is offended, it's evil, it's missing nowadays. So therefore we resort to, let's police the language, because we just want to be seen as nice and polite.
Like, oh, she's parsing words, but there is a difference in the psyche of both the person who hears it and you saying it.
I think you're exactly right.
See, he relents.
I think you're dead on, which is why we're willing to parse that language for farmers. I'm just pushing back on, we don't parse that for us. We don't say if we want to say there's good preachers and bad preachers, we don't say, well, there are preachers who preach good sermons and preachers who preach bad. Yes. No. Name me anything else that where that.
He's noting the contradiction, rightfully so. Although I wouldn't have relented earlier by saying, I understand what you mean.
That sensitive about.
Yeah,
we're not sensitive about any other. But we say there's good accountants and bad accountants. We don't say there are accountants who do good practice and there are accountants who do bad practice. And I'm just trying to make a point that as a culture, perhaps we have been what's the word? I mean, we have allowed ourselves to almost revere to the point of non-obligatory pushback on, I'll say it, bad farming practice.
You can teach an old dog new tricks.
Yeah.
Boy, that was insulting. I don't know how Joel put up with that, but that's insulting. I mean, that is like feminist coded language, if there was any. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. So she's unwilling to relent on the point that Joel brings forth, where he says, you're wrong on this. In essence, that's what he tells her. And she continues to insist on the doctrine that she has held to, which directly contradicts what she herself has said, because I've heard her say it, that she is a believer. I find that highly curious. You're corrected, and yet you refuse to apply the correction. Her viewpoint if you think about it, directly aligns with the very thing that she's criticizing in him. I'll end with this. Think about this for a quick second. When she continues to insist, even though it has already been pointed out to her that she is holding on to an inconsistency in her viewpoint, she is in essence being a defender of those that think wrongly, especially when someone has pointed out that they are holding on to something that is erroneous. Correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't Christianity teach that once you have been alerted to the fact that you are engaging in evil, once you have been reprimanded and you insist on holding on to that which is evil, which is sinful, isn't that, in a sense, doubly evil? Isn't that doubly problematic? Because I know some of you will say, well, when you go to Paul and what he talks about in the Areopagus, God has put everything up until this point in time under ignorance. But once you've been informed and you continue to insist, I think I'm going to hold on to my myth, I think I'm going to hold on to this wrong think, isn't she in essence admitting that she is part of the very people she's seeming or trying to protect in her statements of trying to hold on to naivetes, to things that are wrong, to essentially doctrines that are erroneous? I'm going to tell you how to fix all of this personally, because I think it's one thing to look at this in an abstract, but it's another thing to apply it personally so that one doesn't practice the very abstraction or thing that you see in another. What Joel is trying to describe here, I'm going to use different terminology, the spirit that is invaded and allowed to settle into American society is the lack of courage to call evil evil and good good. That's in essence what we have. We don't have, as a country anymore, the courage of Christian conviction to call evil evil and good good, because we want to be seen as generally the religion of niceness or politeness is what is the religion of the country right now, and in Western society in general. I don't want to be seen as disagreeable. I don't want people to see me as not nice. At what expense? At the expense of allowing evil to go unpunished? At the expense of sinfulness to continue unabated? At the expense of the sinner not only gorging themselves on more and more sin, but now demanding that you celebrate it with them, that you engage in it with them, and advance it with them. At that expense? No. What needs to happen personally at an individual level first for you, dear Christian, is to ensure that you have the courage of Christian conviction to call a spade, to call evil what it is, and to diminish in your mind the importance of people's wrong-headed opinions about you in the matter. They may see you as disagreeable. They may see you as a person who isn't polite, but your first allegiance is to Christian principles, is to Christ. That's what it means. That's part of what it means to be a Christian, to hold the Christian principle in high regard, irrespective of what other people think of you. Once you go over that Rubicon, cross that Rubicon in your own mind, suddenly you'll note that your Christian walk will be better, more faithful. Because in that, you'll see that human opinion and what people think about it, elevating it to this high status of as if God said. You'll note that that barrier, once you cross it, it will actually lead you to a more faithful walk. And also, it defeats the fear of what man thinks in your mind and leads you to a place where now you are being more like Christ, who didn't, as we've read before in these live streams at the very beginning of John, he did not submit himself to man's opinions because he knew what's in man. That's the attitude that we have to adopt in all of us. So ensure that you call a spade a spade. Don't tiptoe around it. Be bold, be courageous, be like Christ, in that when you are told, change your language for the sake of those whom are offended. No, I'm not going to change my language. I'm going to double down on calling evil, evil, and calling good, good. Because that is what Christ has called me to do. And then you would demonstrate the courage of Christian conviction. And you will also have the benefit of fulfilling Christ's mandate in your life to be a light and salt to the world. That's what I have for everyone on this edition of Irrespective. I hope that hopefully you watch the whole thing and you take something from this that will help you in your Christian walk. A couple of items before we sign off. Again, as it reads in the chyron here, subscribe, hit that notification bell, click that thumbs up button, and please share our content with others. Don't forget to donate. Helps us to continue to keep the lights on here. And Irrespective, to do what we're doing here, scan that QR code. Conversely, there's a link that you can follow in the description box underneath this video player to donate. I'll remind the audience that our next live stream will be on Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, same bat time, same bat channel. You have to be a Gen Xer or an early millennial to get that reference. I guess I'm aging myself. And don't forget to follow us on the socials. On X, Irrespective77, and on TikTok, the Irrespective is the username. That's all the time I have left for this edition. I hope you will all watch the next live stream again, Sunday, 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until then, adieu and Godspeed.